There's a quiet misunderstanding about Sophia. Most people think it's the arrival, the peace, the integration, the moment when the inner war finally ends. And in a way, it is. But what almost no one tells you is this. Sophia is not where the journey finishes. It's where you run out of places to hide. Because when you reach that deep, settled clarity, when you stop chasing, when you stop reacting, when you no longer need validation, you arrive at something far less comfortable than confusion. You arrive at the edge. And the edge doesn't look like danger. It looks like stillness. A stillness so complete that there are no more excuses left inside you. No more healing to finish first. No more insight to gather. No more shadow to integrate. Just one movement. And this is where most people freeze. Not because they aren't ready, but because for the first time in their lives, they are. Jung understood something unsettling about this stage. Sophia does not reward you with certainty. It removes the last illusion that you still needed. The real risk is not losing someone. It's losing the version of yourself that survived the journey. It's stepping forward without a narrative. It's releasing not just attachment, but identity. And once you see this, once you recognize that the peace you built was never meant to be protected, there is no returning to the comfort of reflection. Only the quiet awareness of standing at the edge of something that will not wait forever. But it may also have made you comfortable in a way you don't want to examine. Your nervous system no longer spikes. Your mind no longer bargains. Your attention no longer orbits what's absent. But you also no longer leap. And this is where the shift becomes uncomfortable. Because stagnation at this level doesn't look like chaos. It looks like wisdom. It sounds like maturity. It feels like control. You tell yourself you are at peace. But if you're honest, there are decisions you've postponed, movements you've delayed, risks you've rebranded as not necessary. Sophia removed your confusion. Now what remains is choice. And choice is far more dangerous than pain ever was. Pain gave you a story. Choice gives you responsibility. And responsibility is what most awakened people quietly avoid. Not because they are weak, but because stepping forward means risking the loss of the identity they fought so hard to build. You are no longer afraid of suffering. You are afraid of dissolving the self that survived it. That is the edge. Growth does not only dissolve pain. It reorganizes identity. You don't just heal wounds. You become someone in relation to that healing. You become the aware one, the integrated one, the one who no longer reacts. And at first, this new structure is necessary. It stabilizes what used to feel chaotic. It replaces longing with composure. It replaces confusion with clarity. But clarity, when held too tightly, begins to crystallize. You no longer cling to people. You cling to equilibrium. You no longer fear chaos. You fear disruption, not because you are fragile, but because you finally feel intact. And intact can become sacred. When something becomes sacred, you protect it. You stop risking it. You stop stretching beyond it. You stop allowing experiences that might disturb the architecture of who you have become. This is where the shift tightens. The identity of the one who awakened becomes the last attachment. Not loud, not obvious, but deeply rooted. You worked hard to reach this state. You survived longing. You survived disillusionment. You survived fragmentation. And now you are composed, self-contained, measured. But movement at this stage no longer threatens your heart. It threatens your image of yourself. And that is far more destabilizing. What makes this stage dangerous is not what you might lose. It's what you might stop being. Up until now, your growth had a storyline. There was pain. There was integration. There was becoming. Even your suffering had direction. It shaped you into someone perceptive, measured, capable of depth. But movement beyond Sophia has no storyline attached to it. There is no identity upgrade waiting. No new label. No spiritual badge. Just action. And action at this level feels exposed. Because once you move without narrative, you cannot explain yourself in advance. You cannot frame it as healing. You cannot justify it as integration. You are simply choosing. And choice without justification feels naked. This is why so many remain suspended here. Not in confusion, not in pain, but in analysis. You revisit your clarity. You refine your understanding. You polish your perspective. And it feels productive. But nothing actually changes. Because the change required now is not internal alignment. It is external movement. An external movement risks something subtle. It risks dissolving the identity of the one who arrived. You no longer define yourself by longing, but you still define yourself by the one who overcame it. You are no longer the seeker, but you are the one who stopped seeking, and even that can become a quiet role. If you step forward into something uncertain again, a new relationship, a new path, a new expression of yourself, you risk looking unfinished. You risk not being the composed one anymore. You risk being seen in motion. And motion cannot be controlled the way stillness can. Stillness is dignified. Motion is vulnerable. Sophia gave you dignity. The edge asks for vulnerability. Not the vulnerability of confession. The vulnerability of action. And that is far more unsettling. Because if you act, and it does not unfold perfectly, you cannot retreat into the safety of reflection. You must live inside the outcome. And living inside an outcome means surrendering the illusion that clarity guarantees safety. That is the real fracture line, not between wisdom and ignorance, but between knowing and moving. You know, that is no longer the question. The question is whether you are willing to let knowing become insufficient. At this level, avoidance no longer looks like fear. It looks like maturity. You do not panic anymore. You do not chase. You do not collapse into urgency. You pause. You observe. You wait for what feels aligned. From the outside, this is growth. And in many ways, it is. But Jung noticed something subtle in patients who had reached a high degree of integration. When inner conflict softens, the ego becomes stable. And when the ego becomes stable, it can quietly mistake stability for completion. Not in arrogance. In self-containment. Jung called this a refined form of inflation. Not superiority. Not grandiosity. But the belief that because the psyche feels organized, the movement is finished. Individuation, however, was never about becoming internally quiet. It was about maintaining a living relationship between ego and self. And relationship requires movement. If the ego clings to equilibrium, it resists the next demand of the self. That resistance does not feel like regression. It feels like discernment. It feels like protection of hard-earned peace. You tell yourself you are preserving balance. But sometimes you are preserving identity. You no longer cling to a person. You cling to composure. You no longer fear chaos. You fear disruption. Not because you are fragile, but because you are finally intact. And intact has become sacred. When something becomes sacred, you defend it. You reduce risk. You choose predictability. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, individuation stalls. Not because you failed, but because you stopped moving. Sophia stabilized you. But stabilization was never the final act. It was the condition necessary for the next one. And the next act does not refine you further. It destabilizes you on purpose. Crossing the edge does not feel like transcendence. It feels like exposure. There is no surge of certainty. No dramatic inner confirmation. Just a quiet recognition that reflection is no longer enough. Jung described a moment in individuation when opposing forces inside the psyche can no longer be resolved by analysis alone. He called it the transcendent function, not a mystical event. A tension, a living pressure between what you know and what you have not yet embodied. At Sophia, You have integrated your shadow. You have reduced inner fragmentation. But integration creates tension of a different kind. Not chaos. Polarity. You know who you are, and you sense who you could become. The space between those two identities begins to press. That pressure is the edge. If you stay in reflection, the tension remains internal. But the transcendent function is not fulfilled through thought. It is fulfilled through movement, through action that allows something new to emerge between what you were and what you are becoming. This is why crossing feels destabilizing. You are not escaping pain. You are stepping into transformation without a script. The first movement is almost invisible. You choose without rehearsing every outcome. You initiate without securing emotional guarantees. You allow yourself to be seen in motion. And motion removes polish. It reveals uncertainty again. You may feel temporarily less composed, less defined, less certain, and the mind will attempt to interpret that sensation as regression. But it is not regression. It is expansion beyond the identity that integration built. The ego prefers coherence. The self prefers growth. When you act, the ego loses its controlled perimeter, but the psyche gains aliveness. And aliveness does not feel neat. It feels vulnerable. The crossing begins when you tolerate that vulnerability instead of retreating to stability. When you allow tension to resolve through experience instead of thought. When you let the transcendent function unfold in reality rather than in imagination. It does not feel heroic. It feels ordinary. A conversation initiated. A direction chosen. A door walked through without internal ceremony. And afterward, something subtle shifts. Not perfection. Not triumph. Capacity. You realize that your stability was not fragile. It was mobile. You were never meant to protect your peace from movement. You were meant to carry it into movement. That is the beginning of crossing. Not spectacle. Embodiment. It usually appears in ordinary moments. In the message you almost don't send, because part of you prefers staying composed. In the opportunity you almost don't take, because rejection would disturb the equilibrium you've built. In the truth you almost don't speak, because you've become so skilled at being stable that honesty now feels disruptive. Jung would have recognized this tension immediately, not as confusion, but as polarity. The ego seeks coherence. The self seeks expansion. At Sophia, the ego feels organized, integrated, calm. But the self does not measure growth by calmness. It measures growth by movement. The tremor you feel before acting is not regression. It is psychic energy asking for expression. If you retreat into reflection again, the tension remains internal. If you move, the tension resolves through experience. That is the subtle violence of the edge. Nothing outside is forcing you, but something inside refuses to shrink. Crossing begins when you stop treating your peace as something fragile and start carrying it into uncertainty. If you remain at the edge and simply do not cross, nothing collapses. That is what makes it deceptive. The impact is not explosive. It is immediate, but subtle. Your days remain functional. You remain composed. You continue understanding yourself with precision. But something changes in texture. You hesitate more often. You feel the impulse to act and override it. You sense expansion and rationalize postponement. Not dramatically, quietly. Your intuition speaks. Your mind negotiates. And negotiation wins. At first, this feels responsible, measured, mature. But over time, the body begins to register something else. A slight contraction. A faint restlessness. Not longing. Not pain. Just a muted sense that something is underutilized. Energy that once moved outward now circulates inward. Jung observed that when psychic energy is not expressed through conscious movement, it does not disappear. It turns. It seeks outlet. And when it cannot find one in action, It often expresses itself as subtle dissatisfaction. You may call it boredom. You may call it calm. But beneath the calm, there is compression. You are stable, but less alive. You are clear, but less engaged. The psyche does not stagnate peacefully. It stagnates politely, and polite stagnation is difficult to detect. You will not feel crisis. You will feel delay. You will not feel despair. You will feel neutrality stretched too thin. That is the immediate cost. Not suffering. Diminishment. Now extend that pattern across time. Years. Decades. You maintain composure. You avoid unnecessary disruption. You remain the wise one, the grounded one, the one who does not overreach. From the outside, your life appears intact. From the inside, something gradually narrows. You become excellent at observing life, less practiced at inhabiting it. Jung warned that individuation does not tolerate indefinite suspension. When growth is resisted long enough, the psyche compensates. Not always through breakdown, sometimes through quiet regret, a recognition, late in life, that safety became the organizing principle, that expansion was postponed so often it became unfamiliar, that you preserved stability but forfeited possibility. This is not dramatic tragedy. It is something more subtle, a life lived competently but not fully. And what makes this particularly piercing at Sophia is this. You would know. You would know that you had reached the capacity for more. You would know that the edge was real. You would know that movement was available. And that knowledge, carried over years without action, becomes heavy. Not guilt. Weight. The weight of unrealized expansion. The psyche does not punish, but it does remember. And when you are honest with yourself in quiet moments, you would sense the distance between who you became and who you allowed yourself to remain. That is the existential cost of not crossing. Not destruction. Contraction. By the time you reach Sophia, something fundamental has already shifted. You no longer confuse reaction with authenticity. You no longer mistake intensity for depth. You no longer chase clarity. You have it, and clarity removes your final defense. Before, hesitation could hide behind healing, behind confusion, behind pain. Now hesitation stands exposed. If you remain at the edge, it is no longer because you are wounded. It is because you are unwilling. That sentence may feel sharp. It is meant to. Jung insisted that individuation is not passive. It is participatory. The self does not force transformation. It presents tension. The ego must answer. At Sophia, the tension is no longer internal chaos. It is external movement. There is no more insight required. No more integration needed. The work that remains is behavioral, embodied, visible. And that is precisely why it feels risky. You cannot think your way through this stage. You cannot meditate your way through it. You cannot analyze it into resolution. You must act. And action eliminates ambiguity. Action reveals whether your awakening was structural or performative, whether your stability is alive or preserved. This is why the edge feels final. Because once you cross, you cannot return to the safety of endless preparation. You become responsible for the life that unfolds. You can no longer say, "I'm still becoming." You are. Now you must live accordingly. There is no dramatic music at this threshold. No ceremony. No announcement. Just a decision. You already know what it is. The conversation you have postponed. The path you have examined but not entered. The version of yourself that requires visible risk. You do not need more time. You need courage. And courage at this stage is not emotional intensity. It is calm action. It is stepping forward without rehearsing the future. It is releasing control of how stable you appear. It is accepting that maturity does not exempt you from uncertainty. Jung never described Sophia as an endpoint. He described it as readiness. Readiness for conscious choice. and readiness without movement curdles into stagnation. The threshold is not there to frighten you. It is there to clarify you, to reveal whether you trust the ground you built. If you do not move, life will eventually move you. But chosen movement builds strength. Forced movement builds shock. You have the rare opportunity to choose. Most people never reach this clarity. They remain in confusion. You are not confused. You are clear. And clarity demands response. There comes a point in individuation where preparation becomes disguise. You have prepared enough. You have reflected enough. You have integrated enough. If you are honest, what remains is not uncertainty. It is hesitation. And hesitation at this level is no longer protection. It is resistance. Not loud resistance. Refined resistance. You reach Sophia. Now comes the real risk. Not of losing someone. Not of falling apart. But of stepping forward without a script. Of dissolving the identity that carried you here. Of allowing yourself to be unfinished again. If you feel tension right now, that is not regression. It is aliveness pressing outward. The edge is not asking you to be reckless. It is asking you to be congruent. Congruent with the clarity you already possess. There is no more preparation required. Only participation. If you remain still, you will remain stable. But you will also remain smaller than you could be. If you move, you may feel exposed. But you will feel alive. That is the trade. And at this stage, you cannot pretend you do not see it. You have reached the point where wisdom is no longer about understanding. It is about embodiment. The edge will not shout at you. It will wait, but it will not disappear. And neither will the quiet knowledge that you were meant to cross. The question is no longer whether you are ready. At the edge, peace is not a home. It is a spine.